What up, Wizards? It's Dev, SBMTG. We like it a magic. Back to some of them Throne of Eldraine spoilers that you crave. Today was a day of quality, more so than quantity. We didn't get 22, 24 cards that we have been on a lot of days this spoiler season. Instead, what we did get to see, some choice nuggets. So let's go ahead and get to it right after you like and give me one of them meatball subscribes. Now, even though there is a lot of constructed candy today, there's still some limited love, like Ventress Palette. This is 4 mana, 3 and a blue for a 2/2 flying human knight, but there's adamant on this. If you used at least 3 blue mana to cast this spell, Paladin comes into play with a +1/+1 counter. So, not so bad. 4 mana, 3/3 flying, I'll pay for that. But a 4 mana, 2/2 flying, even though it's not ideal, is still a decent curve filler in limited. So the card's not terrible. But there was another card from this morning that's ostensibly meant for limited play, I think, but there's a possibility that there's more than that here. This is Unexplained Vision. 4 and a blue for a sorcery. Draw 3 cards. But this too has adamant. If you spend at least 3 mana, 3 blue mana, rather, to cast it, you scry 3, and that's actually not too bad. We do already have a card like this from Guilds of Ravnica block. Here it is on your screen right there. You see it. Now, the thing is, I think this might be just a little bit better, slightly, in a format with Teferi. The 3 mana Teferi allows you to just cast this on your opponent's end step, and that's really good. Now, you could do that with the Addendum spell from Ravnica block, but you really want to cast that spell with Addendum to get the scries, and you can't do that if it's your opponent's turn. So this card might win that war, plus it's a little bit easier to cast as far as the colored mana symbols in its CMC. So I like that as well. I think there might be something here, apart from the crazy art. I don't know what the story implication of this is. It is unexplained. It's totally confusing in that the Royal Scions apparently finally get to the magic mirror to ask it a question, and it just shows them like a deer. I don't understand it, but the card is interesting. But that's not the end of limited playable stuff from this morning. There was also Tempting Witch. I saw this art forever ago. I've been waiting to see what this card does, and it kind of doesn't disappoint in a way. This is 3 mana, 2 and a black for a 1/3 human warlock, and when it ETBs, you create a food token. But you can pay 2 and tap it and sack a food to have a player lose 3 life. That is really interesting, having a way, especially in limited, especially draft for that matter, for the green-black food deck, to convert these food tokens into damage. I really like that this provides you reach, has at least a decent body, not necessarily for the raid, but a 1/3 is going to block some small stuff and survive. I like that about it, but mostly just the ability to not only get a food token on ETB, don't discount how good that might be, because that's 3 life right there, synergies with any food stuff that you're running, but mostly the ability to convert food into, rather than life, actual damage output. That is really, really important, I imagine, in the limited environment. I think it's a little bit costed out of constructed playability, but that remains to be seen. There's also Mad Radder today. This actually begins a cycle of cards that could have been keyworded, but there's probably just not quite enough of these in the format to actually have gotten keyworded. But anyway, this is 4 mana, 3 and a red for a 1/2 goblin. And whenever you draw your second card each turn, you create 2 1/1 black rat creature tokens. So if you've got the support to actually draw multiple cards in the, again, in limited specifically, if you're able to draft up the correct deck, then this might actually be really good if it can provide just, 2 extra bodies a game for you. It's not bad at all. It does cost a lot as far as the initial investment, but especially if you can proc it like twice in limited, you're just putting bodies on the battlefield like crazy, so I really like this. And I guess in constructed, this kind of goes with that Pied Piper card from like last week, but this deck looks so janky. I'm mostly interested in the limited applications of this. If you can get something that just draws you a card every turn, and there are multiple cards we've already seen that can do that for you in this set, and another one we'll look at a little bit later on in the video. Just draw you an extra card pretty much every turn, guaranteed, and that is so many bodies. This will win you a game of limited if you're able to actually pull that combo off. But again, there's a bunch of cards in this cycle. We also saw Iron Crag Pyromancer looking thick. What you doing? How you doing? This is 3 mana, 2 and a red for a 0/4 human wizard. And whenever you draw your second card each turn, Pyromancer deals 3 damage to any target. That looks really neat right off the rip, It joins a long line of electrostatic fields and gutter snipes, but instead of proccing on casting instants or sorceries, you're only going to get this once a turn, and even then it's not guaranteed. But obviously this goes really well, not only with, again, things that draw you an extra card pretty much every turn, guaranteed. Royal Scions, +1 will do that for you. Teferi won't draw you a card every single turn, but it does have a draw a card ability on it. Vraska, I suppose, the 4-mana Planeswalker. There are a few different cards in this format already that will draw you extra cards every single turn, so, you know, getting 3, 6, 9 damage off of this can easily win you a game, and I imagine multiple copies of it is really good too. It's out of range of a lot of red removal spells. There's just a lot to like about this, but it might be priced out at 3 mana. We saw this ability on a couple of other creatures, though, and these are lower rarity and more limited playable than anything else, but Steelgaze Griffin and Blood Haze Wolverine nonetheless look like decent cards. Griffin is a 5 mana, 4 and a blue, 2/4 Griffin with flying, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, Griffin gets +2/+0 until end of turn, so having a 5 mana, 4/4 flyer is a pretty decent rate, but again, you don't necessarily mind a 5 mana, 2/4 flyer. It's a little crappy, but you're going to want to play flyers with a relatively high toughness, especially in your limited deck anyway, so there's pretty low opportunity cost to putting this in your deck. Mostly if you can support this in limited, it's not a bad deal, but you're probably going to slot it in anyway as a curve filler. Same thing with Blood Haze Wolverine, but I like this a little bit more. 2 mana, 1 and a red for a 2/1 Wolverine, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, Wolverine gets +1/+1 and gains first strike. This is especially good in combat if you can cast an Opt, or maybe cast the 1 red mana half of Merchant of the Veil. That's another great card. It's going to work in standard with these really well. But in limited, also a really nice trick. You can run it into combat or wait for your opponent to attack in, and then suddenly draw your second card of the turn one way or another. And then Wolverine is going to be really, really nice for its mana cost, especially when it gets the first strike. 3 power first strike is going to take down most things, even above its mana cost in limited environments. So I like a lot about this too, but I guess the worst thing about these creatures and this sort of pseudo prowess ability on them is that you're only going to proc them once a turn. Again, I need to point that out because it's not like Wolverine's ever going to get to 4 power. It would be absurd if it could, but only proccing these once a turn feels like a pretty bad part of the pseudo mechanic here, but at the same time, a card like Wolverine especially is priced in such a way that you're going to play it as curve filler anyway, but when it's good, it's really good. But one of the most promising cards with this sort of new mechanic on it is Improbable Alliance. This is red and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you create a 1/1 blue fairy creature token with flying. And you can also pay 4, a red, and a blue, 6 mana to draw a card and then discard a card. So again, in sealed and draft, this is a great sort of engine for all these cards that do something when you draw your second card each turn. Really like that about it, and I love the rarity too. You might actually be able to pick up 2 copies of this, especially in draft. You might be able to pick up more than that depending on what's going around. So I really like this as a sort of payoff for this mechanic, but it looks promising in standard. 2 mana isn't really a bad initial investment for this. You might not ever actually activate it, but if you can pay the 2 mana for it on turn 2, or at least relatively early in the game, then you can just start opting on your opponent's turn, casting Chemist's Insight, bunch of other stuff, and actually proccing this like somewhat reliably and getting an extra flyer once a turn, sometimes even on your opponent's turn. That just seems really, really good to me. Now, there's a couple other lower rarity cards to go over from this morning and afternoon, but they do look pretty interesting, like Mantle of Tides. This is just 1 blue mana for an artifact that's an equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+2. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, it's one of those, it's the last one actually, attach Mantle of Tides to target creature you control, or you can just equip it for 3 mana. Now this is neat. It is definitely no replacement for Curious Obsession, but it's probably a little bit better than it looks, especially in decks that want to play early artifacts. This is a great 1-drop artifact for them if they're playing creatures aside from that, but I really like this. In small aggro decks in this color, it might not be worth a card, but it's going to save your creature from sorcery speed removal some of the time, or you're going to be able to run your creatures into combat, or again block with creatures, and then draw either your second card if it's your turn, or play like a Chemist's Insight and draw 2 cards on your opponent's turn, and then suddenly you can attach this to whatever creature you want, so it makes all of your creatures a pretty suitable threat in combat. And again, protecting them from removal is a really nice mode on this too. If your opponent tries to Bone Crusher Giant, the spell half of Bone Crusher Giant, one of your guys, then just cast an Opt if it's your attack step, and then suddenly you can move it to that guy and protect your creatures. So I really like the implications of this, and it's at a pretty aggressive mana cost, but it's going to have to be worth a slot in the decks that want it, and that again remains to be seen. But probably the best looking common from today is Gingerbread House. That's right. Really cute. Gingerbread House. It's a land. It's actually a forest, too. And it taps for green mana. And it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more forests. And when it enters the battlefield untapped, you create a food token. Now, this looks pretty unassuming and maybe even like the worst of the cycle. But if you're playing like green X food in standard, or in limited for that matter, this is a pretty easy include. So it's not like I don't like the card, and there's again fairly low opportunity cost to actually putting this in your deck, especially if you're mono green. Why not get the food token, right? So it's a good Magic card, and it's definitely playable in the food decks. So there's that at the very least. But one of the cool reasons that I think this card is like kind of under the radar and might actually impact a constructed format is because it's playable in Pauper. Really like that this is another card that sort of keeps Pauper Burn down, and that's a deck that sort of needs keeping down. It's just easy mode in Pauper for some players. So any card that's playable in that format and actually looks halfway decent against Burn, pretty good to me, although I do question that getting this on turn 4 and having to pay 2 mana to pop the food token is truly good against Pauper Burn. It's going to be at least worth experimenting. And back to standard for just a second while we wrap things up. I think that even though this looks like one of the worst in the cycle that we've seen so far for these common lands that require other basic land types to be untapped when they enter the battlefield. That's a mouthful. But anyway, this cycle here, I think it's one of the worst on its face. But a card like this just gains a little bit more relevance just due to the fact that it's a forest. We're in a format right now where we have Nissa who shakes the world, so forests are just slightly more valuable than every other land type. That being said, I think this card probably did need to be powered down slightly, which they did, but it's still pretty decent against aggro, and it's going to create double mana with a Nissa out, so it's going to see some play one way or the other. Now back to yesterday for a second. There are actually 2 cards from yesterday I haven't covered yet, but I'm going to save one of them towards the end of the video. But let's look at Shepherd of the Flock here real quick. This is 2 mana, 1 and a white for a 3/1 human peasant. But, I mean, that's it as far as the creature half, but it has a spell half too. Usher to safety, just 1 white mana for an instant. Return target permanent you control to its owner's hand, so you can save your own creatures from removal or repeat enter the battlefield effects and stuff. I really like this thing. I think that it's subtly a very playable card. It's just 2 mana for a 3/1, which isn't exciting stats, but it's at least going to block for you against aggro decks and usually even trade up some of the time. And if you have to get aggressive with it, you can get aggressive with it too. It's got a decent stat line against both control and aggro, so I don't mind this stat line, especially at this rate. 2 mana 3/1s are at least okay, especially considering Goblin Chain Whirler, Fanatical Firebrand, both leaving the format. You got to point that out too with these 1 toughness cards. They're just a lot better than they were just a month ago, so I like that about it. But the spell half of this is what I'm really excited for. Just 1 mana for this effect is at least okay. Again, we've got a lot of repeatable enter the battlefield triggers in this format right now that are super desirable to get 1, 2, 3 times, so I like this for that. And again, saving your creatures from removal and then getting another creature is a really nice tempo play. But now we're getting into the truly juicy stuff from today. Here's Tenacious Tonight, a black and a red for a 2/2 human knight with menace. And at the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card and loses 1 life. Whew, that seems pretty hot on the surface. Card looks good to me, again, at first glance. 2 mana, 2/2 menace. Like the stat line on this in really aggressive decks, because especially in the early game, where you're looking to attack the most, menace is a really relevant keyword that's a great form of evasion, so, especially in a format with some relatively low-end flyers. And we're definitely in one of those. Flying isn't necessarily a truly evasive ability in a format like that. Menace, much more so. So, big fan of the stat line and the keyword on this. For the rate, it's pretty nice, but obviously the real popcorn on this is being able to draw an extra card every turn at the expense of your opponent also getting to draw that card. That's definitely the drawback on this, and I think it might be big enough to kill the card, but that said, 2 mana is a great rate for this. It really is. Plus, it triggers Spectacle every single turn, and it draws you a card every single turn, so it goes pretty well with that 3 mana Ironclad lady that we saw earlier in the video that bolts something every time you draw your second card of the turn. This guarantees that you draw 2 every single turn. So that's pretty nice interaction right there. But any of those cards, this goes pretty well with, but really in aggro decks, I think this is probably going to be desirable, but only in the early turns of the game. You get this on turn 2, and then you want to kill them by turn 5. You drew 3 extra cards, they drew 3 extra cards, but you want to kill them before they're able to actually use any of the expensive cards that you gave to them, especially if they're in ramp or control or mid-range. You want to be able to actually, like, use your cards more effectively than they can because they just won't have the time to do so. So I like the look of this card, but really remains to be seen whether this is as good as it looks, but it undeniably looks very good. But let's move on here to the Great Henge. This is 9 mana, 7 and 2 green for a legendary artifact. But here's the catch. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. You can tap it for 2 green and gain 2 life. And whenever a non-token, there's more. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. That's nuts, right? That's banana bread. This thing is crazy. In a way, you know, if you get like Rotting Regisaur on turn 3, you can get this on turn 4. If you get Lovestruck Beast on turn 3, you can get this on turn 4. There are plenty of ways to actually pull it off in Standard. And it is the wasabi. Like, this card is very hot when you actually get it down. You probably have to take a turn off to play it. That said, you can tap it for 2 green and play, like, you know, Barkhide Troll or whatever it's called, or any other 2 green card. You know, the legendary 2 green mana Knight that we saw yesterday. You can play this, or you can play that off of tapping this the turn that you play it. So, or Paradise Druid, whatever. You know, there's multiple plays you can make without having to necessarily just pass your turn and do nothing besides tap there, play this. That said, even if you don't have anything else, you'll probably tap this the turn that you play it or on your opponent's turn just to gain the 2 life. It's good for that if nothing else. So there's a lot to like about just a Beast Whisperer that's not really susceptible to as much removal as Beast Whisperer was. Just that clause in the card makes it very much worth playing, in my opinion. Even if you have to pay, you know, 4 or even 5 mana for it, it's not going to be too tough to get down by, again, turn 4, turn 5. And at that point, it's just an absolutely bonkers card that makes it so that every creature that you draw for the rest of the game is super fresh card advantage that allows you to just, like, keep digging through your library. In a way, it could be, like, seen as an experimental frenzy if you're playing enough creatures in your deck to actually make this pop off. Oh, and by the way, it puts +1/+1 counters on them, so, like, Incubation Druid or any other cards that benefit from +1/+1 counters, like Growth Chamber Guardian. There's just a lot you can do with this card, you know. It's ramp, it's life gain, and it's card advantage, and it makes your creatures bigger. It's just everything the card does is absolutely just ridiculous. So it's going to see play in Standard as maybe a 1 or 2 of, in Stompy decks, some aggressive decks, some mid-range decks, but it's probably going to see play in Commander too until the end of time. I just don't see how this isn't in, like, every green Commander deck ever built from here into eternity. But there's a little bit more to discuss today. Just now, actually, we got Fabled Passage. This is a land. You can tap it and sack it to search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. But here's the thing. If you control 4 or more lands, you untap that land. That's actually pretty good, I guess. This is the best version of, like, Terramorphic Expanse or Evolving Wilds that we've ever seen, playable in Standard at the very least. I really like this thing. I keep, like, warming up to it. Right before I went on camera, it got previewed, and I was like, oh, it's okay. But again, the more I look at it, the more I like this thing. I think that especially multicolored decks that still make room for basic lands are going to want this thing, especially mid-range and control decks that are going to very often get the land untapped when it matters in the relative mid to late game. So I do like that. I like it in Field of the Dead decks, where it's probably just going to see a 1, possibly 2 of, but very more likely a 1 of. Just because it's an extra land for Field of the Dead to help you get to that, you know, 7 uniquely named lands mark. And needless to say, if you're proccing Field of the Dead with this twice in 1 card, much like you can with Evolving Wilds, you know, we'll have that trick available in Standard still, thanks to this card. You know, you're basically getting 2 zombies at the price of 1 card. But if you're proccing Field of the Dead, it's safe to say that the land that you fetch is also coming into play untapped. So I like this a lot. Goes in monocolored decks, goes in multicolored decks, especially decks that are really trying to stretch the mana base, again, provided that they've made room for those basic lands. So, huge fan of this. Probably sees play in Standard as at least a 1 of in some decks that want it, but some decks are going to want to go all the way and play 3 or 4 of this, I imagine. But final card of the day, for now at least. This is Brazen Borrower. Old BB, 3 mana, 1 and 2 blue for 3/1 flash flying fairy rogue that can block only creatures with flying, but Petty Theft is 2 mana for an instant. Return target non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. This card is the cream. This is the butter right here. I really, really like this. There's a reason I saved it for last, and there's a reason it's mythic. I kind of hate that it's mythic, but it's kind of been the #1 thing I've seen people say about this. Like, oh, it doesn't look mythic to me. Well, in terms of playability in constructed formats, yeah, this definitely looks mythic. Hate that we're going to have to spend mythic wildcards to play it on Arena, and I hate that it's probably going to be relatively expensive to get your hands on in paper, again, because of the mythicality. But moving on from that, the function of the card is absolutely beautiful to me. I like what they did with the room here. You know, just 2 mana is basically disperse, and I love that it's not limited to creatures or anything. It's just non-land permanents. You'd be surprised how important that is if you've ever played a card like Blink of an Eye, or again Dispersed, and you know how good this can be. Not being restricted to just creatures. So do keep that in mind, but this is amazing card advantage in a way. I can compare it to Blink of an Eye again, because Blink of an Eye for 4 mana will draw you a card and have this effect. But this for 5 mana just gets you a creature, and I think that's probably going to be better in most situations. It blocks flyers really, really well, so do keep that in mind. That's going to be important against a number of decks. You know, it probably lines up pretty well against a good number of especially early flyers in the format, like Empyrean Eagle especially, so do keep that in mind. But it also, again, attacks really well. This 3/1 stat line, especially in the air, is going to probably end up doing a fair amount of damage against control, especially considering that you were able to gain the good tempo off of it, you know? Get rid of their Teferi or whatever planeswalker or enchantment they had to slap down on turn 2 or 3, and you get a creature out of the deal. Really, really like this thing. It can sit in exile for 2, 3, 4 turns or whatever, and this is actually a pretty cool thing against control. Now that I mention it, you know, against control, you can return something to their hand during their, you know, end step or something like that, and then develop your board. If they sweep your board, you've got a creature in exile you can play. That's true of all these adventure cards, but I think that this is one of the best, if not the best, adventure card that we've seen so far. And again, it's mythic for a reason. This is a lot better than it looks. It turns out when you staple these 2 cards together, it makes 2 cards that are relatively mediocre on their face much, much better. The implications of this are relatively high. This will see a lot of play in at least the Simic Flash decks, but I wouldn't be surprised if it saw play in a lot more decks than just that. Did I say that was the last card? There's actually one more card. It's another fairy, and the fairies are looking really nice today. This is Fay of Wishes. This is the last card from yesterday, but honestly, I think it's worth being the last card in the video. This is 2 mana for a 1/4 fairy wizard with flying. You can pay 1 and a blue and discard 2 cards to return Fay of Wishes to its owner's hand, but the adventure half of this is granted 4 mana, 3 and a blue for a sorcery. You may choose a non-creature card you own from outside the game, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Now there is so much play on this card, just like the last fairy that we looked at. This could go in a lot of different decks, and I love the stat line on it. I would probably play it for the stat line alone, especially in these, you know, blue-white flying decks that do employ Empyrean Eagle and Sigarda and all that stuff. Did I say Sigarda? Excuse me. This card right here. But anyway, aside from that, the stat line in those decks is good enough, but the stat line in most decks is good enough. A 2 mana 1/4 flyer, that is so much toughness with an evasive ability at a relatively low mana cost that the card is probably playable for that reason, if nothing else. But look at everything else it does. It can save itself from being removed from the battlefield either by sweepers or spot removal. Then you can just cast the instant or the sorcery half of it again. If you haven't done that yet, you can just do it for the first time. But this is the really juicy part of the card. The sorcery half of this is basically a wish that's playable in not only standard but modern, for that matter. You know, in standard, this can do a lot of things. It's basically going to fill a similar role as Mastermind's Acquisition did in the previous format, but it's much easier to cast in terms of, again, colored mana symbols than Mastermind's was, and it's in a color that probably benefits from having this effect a little bit more, or at least the same, you know. This can fetch up counter spells and stuff if you need that, or card draw, or just a win condition in the form of a planeswalker or an important enchantment or artifact. All these legendary artifacts we've been seeing, this can fetch up for you. It's just got so much. that it can do for you out of your sideboard. I've always really liked cards like this, whether it's Wishes in Modern or Mastermind's Acquisition or, Karn the Great Creator. This is just or even the new Vivian that no one's played yet. I just really think this is a super unique ability, and it's always somewhat breakable. And when it's stapled to a really aggressively statted creature, it's just, there's no way this card doesn't see someplace somewhere. There's a lot of weird tricks you can do with it, so can't wait to see what it actually does, but it will do something, no doubt. But that's it for the spoilers, and I told you, not a whole lot of cards today, but more to talk about than we usually have to talk about. There's so much crazy-ish this morning and afternoon, and there might even be couple more cards waiting to come out today, but we'll get to it tomorrow. Just let me know how you felt about today's batch of cookies down there in the sideboard, and if you didn't do it earlier when I asked you to, just take the time now. If you would, please puts me in more recommended feeds, and then give me that meatball sub there, subscribe to the channel again if you haven't done that yet. If you have $1 a month, it's really all I ask, then go over to the Patreon, link in the description. You can pay $1 1 month. That's all I ask, a soda a month, and then you can help determine what decks we do first for Throne of Eldraine Standard. So not a terrible investment right there, and it provides value all year round. But anyway, I guess the only other shilling I have to do is to say go over to TCG Player, first link in the description, if you want to pre-order any of these cards or just see what they're going for in the market right now, because some of these might surprise you. They might be a little bit lower than you might assume, so hop on over to the first link and check them out. Even if you're just going to use them as a price guide, pretty good function for that website. So do that, and even, order stuff if you want to. They like that, so do that. But anyway, I think that I am done ski for this one ski, so I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dead from the Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. No matter what you do, spread love and be kind.